Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's a testimony to the good order and shape that the Alliance is in, that so many of you stayed for this last session. So thank you very much for doing it. We're, of course, focusing on politics and security in emerging Asia for the next hour or so. And by way of introduction or getting us underway in this session, it's a great pleasure to welcome the Honourable Tanya Plibersek to join us. Tanya has given me leave not to read her CV. She wants to get on with the job, and I'm grateful for that. It's all in the program, so you can see it all there in all its glory. But of course, she is the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Development. But as at least as importantly, I think, she is the Deputy Leader of the opposition. And I say that because what is fundamentally important, of course, about the Alliance is that it has always been an alliance which has been supported in a bipartisan way. And Tanya being here as a representative of the leadership of the Labor Party once again testifies to that continuing support. This, of course, in the case of the Labor Party, goes back a long way to the very least the dark days of 1941, but of course it is a continuing commitment. And for those of you who know your history of Australian defence and security policy, you'll know that in recent years, last several decades, the Labor Party's commitment has been unerring in relation to the Alliance. There is a contemporary dimension to this. There are many contemporary dimensions to it, but there's one that I particularly wanted to mention because it relates to our activities. It was the Gillard government in 2011 which agreed to make the money available from the Australian government to fund the Alliance 21 project. So it's very fitting in many ways that Tanya is here as a consequence of the fact that the previous government funded this activity. And of course, the Gillard government, the Rudd government, were very strong supporters of the project. I do recall sitting in the Senate at the time, and I do recall how certain agencies of the government were rather displeased that part of their budget was being appropriated for the purposes of the study. I hope those who remember that might now think this is a worthwhile investment. But it's a delight to have Tanya here. I think it's, again, an important testimony of the relationship. There are the fruits of the investment here today, and I think we've benefited from it very considerably. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you. It's a great delight to have you with us. We look forward to your remarks. Tanya is a bit tight for time. She's going to speak, and then if there's any time between the time she finishes and about 4:15, then she's happy to take questions. Whether or not that's the case, we'll see. But ladies and gentlemen, Tanya Plibersek.
Thank you so much, Russell, for that introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We've got some other elders here with us today. I think I saw Robert Hill on the way in. I see my dear friend Gareth Evans here right before me. Distinguished former ambassadors, a number of academics and others that I've worked with over the years. It's wonderful to have each of you here with us today, people who are current practitioners in this area, and of course a number of students that I've met already as well. It's great to see some of our most distinguished and experienced former ministers, former diplomats and others passing on their wisdom to the next generation of people who will hold the fate of their nations in their hands. I want to say how sorry I am to have missed the US Ambassador, His Excellency John Berry, who I know was here earlier, but I was able to catch up with him yesterday. And I also want to acknowledge any members of Parliament who might be here with us today. There might be a few, although on a parliamentary sitting day, you're very lucky if you can get any of us to concentrate for more than 5 minutes on any particular task at hand. So I'm not sure if many have been able to stay. I was given a lot of latitude with my topic, politics and security in an emerging Asia. It's a region, of course, that's vast and it's undergoing profound changes. I could talk about the recent election in India, a significant turning point for the world's largest democracy. I could talk about the election that's coming up in Indonesia, one of our most important and nearest neighbours. But having just returned from China, I think it's a good idea to concentrate instead on what's probably the single biggest issue affecting the region, the rise of China. I made my first visit to China last week. Although China is now our biggest trading partner, and it's 40 years since we gave China diplomatic recognition as the People's Republic of China, there are still some very large gaps in our understanding of one another. One clear gap is the question of what China's rise means for Australia and for our region. There's universal agreement that the rise of China is a key feature of the strategic environment of Asia and of the world. But there continues to be a lot of hand-wringing about what China's rise actually means in practice. Some pundits and scholars predict that conflict is inevitable. Others say that China's integration into the global economy prevents that. Others still say that the US needs to agree now to share power with China, deliberately conceding some power to avoid conflict. Of course, I'm not going to settle these complex questions today, but they are questions that we need to think about, to consider, and to work on, because they are crucial to Australia's security and prosperity. Put in the simplest and starkest way, the question being asked is, can China grow peacefully? There are a lot of signs of China's increasing economic importance for Australia and the world. Since 1978, China's economy has grown rapidly after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. Since that time, more people have been lifted out of poverty than in any one place at any one time in history. It is an extraordinary achievement. The value of one day's trade between China and Australia today is greater than the value of 1 year's trade between China and Australia 40 years ago. China is Australia's largest trading partners, with total trade in goods and services of around $151 billion in 2013. It's our largest export destination, it's our largest source of imports. Viewed globally, China has already grown from under 1/20th of the global economy at the start of this century to an eighth now, when you measure its economy at market rates. Over the same period, the US economy has fallen from just under a third of the global economy to a fifth. So that still makes the American economy twice as large as China's, but it gives you some indication of how quickly the lines are converging. On another measure of economic size, purchasing power parity, China has already overtaken the US. So that there's no arguing that China is a rising economic power, but there is some argument about the extent to which the size of an economy is a useful guide to power in its broadest sense. China's economic growth brings the challenge of rising expectations. Rising expectations from the people of China for a social safety net, for better health and education, for jobs, for a better quality of life more generally, including a cleaner environment. China's got a new generation of young people who are well-travelled, who've studied overseas. They're more engaged with the world, they're less suspicious of it. Last year, there were 235,000 international students from China in the United States and 90,000 Chinese students in Australia. I hope that most of them return home with a good impression of our nations. I'm sure that many return home with lifelong friendships and business partnerships. They certainly return home with broader expectations of what they can expect from their own lives in China. The question that goes along with this increase in expectations is, does China's economic growth create expectations in its leadership as well, that they'll have a greater say in regional and global affairs? And what form does that greater influence take, and how far can it be accommodated? The benefits of a growing Chinese economy are unquestionable for Australia. Our economies are complementary rather than competitive. China's demand for our resources has been a strong underpinning of our economic growth in recent decades. And there are new opportunities too for trade in services and in agricultural products, particularly with the growing Chinese middle class. Yet, in spite of the undoubted economic benefits of China's rise, some historians and scholars warn that we should be wary. They point out that when a rising power emerges to challenge a dominant power, conflict may result. The crucial point, of course, is that this doesn't have to happen, and it doesn't always happen. Conflict is not inevitable. And I think I'd add to that we all have a responsibility to avert conflict. The precedents of the past that are used to support the argument of the risk of conflict occurred in different times in different places. Western history may not be the best guide to what's happening in Asia today. And in so many ways, what we're facing is unprecedented. One reason is our understanding of the sheer horror of full-scale war in a nuclear age. Another reason is the high degree of economic interdependence that I mentioned earlier. China's and America's prosperity, indeed the prosperity of the globe, rests on the relationship between China and the United States. But even if the chance of full-scale conflict in our region is low, we can never assume it to be zero. The Australian government's first responsibility is to protect its citizens, and that means being ready for worst-case scenarios, even as we work to avoid them. And, of course, there's always the possibility of something less than full-scale conflict. There have been fewer wars in recent decades, but, of course, they've not stopped altogether. We should also strive to avoid that possibility of more limited conflict, which, limited conflict, nobody ever knows where limited conflicts lead in the end. But we should invest in preventing a regional arms race as well. It's an expense that no one needs. In a speech last month, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, outlined two scenarios for the future strategic landscape in Asia. One scenario was a peaceful and integrated Asia, with a more powerful China acting as a status quo power that adheres to international law and norms. While China and the US would compete for influence, they would accommodate each other on many issues. Prime Minister Lee's other scenario is not as optimistic. His other scenario was a riven and fractious Asia, US-China relations fraught with tension, pushed by a zero-sum view of the world and a lack of mutual trust. Which scenario comes to pass would depend on US-China relations and the path of nationalism in both countries, he contended. Prime Minister Lee said, on both sides there are those who would doubt and distrust each other's intentions. It will require great restraint and wisdom to overcome this distrust and to reach a workable and peaceful accommodation. So what can we do to avoid Prime Minister Lee's pessimistic scenario? Paul Keating argued in a speech in Beijing last November that great powers need to work together to create a new Asian order, an order that reflects and accommodates the new distribution of power, while at the same time preserving the features that have underwritten stability in recent decades. Paul Keating said, China's most important responsibility now is to explain more clearly and in more detail how it sees the new Asian order working, what role it sees itself taking, what role it envisages for others, how core norms and principles will be upheld. American sentiment and behaviour, of course, is just as important as China's, and I think there are times when the US could make more of its opportunities to promote engagement with China. In the Financial Times last month, commentator Edward Luce argued that America's ability to address these vast challenges is stymied by domestic paralysis. He said the US holds more cards than any other country in shaping the New World Order, but that new order needs to accommodate a relatively stronger China, and it's not clear that America recognises this challenge. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated at the moment and which I believe earlier speakers today talked about, is being negotiated between the US and many other countries in the region, and it's possible that this is one opportunity that may be missed. The TPP is a key economic element of President Obama's pivot to Asia. It could be a catalyst for binding countries together more tightly, reducing trade barriers among most of Asia's major economies and reinforcing rules on free and open trade. But support for the TPP amongst both Democrats and Republicans in the US is weak, and China's looking for its own trade agreement with its neighbours in the region. It's excluded from the TPP, of course, and it thinks that it can make its own deal as a better deal. Congress has also failed to agree on changing the rules of the International Monetary Fund to give more say to Asian countries. Scholar Fareed Zakaria says China, Indonesia and Singapore see this as a sign that the West will never let them share real power in global institutions. The US Senate has refused to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines the rights and responsibilities of nations in the use of the world's oceans. Opponents of the ratification argue that it cedes sovereign power. The administration, of course, say that they're abiding by the rules anyway, so ratification is not important. But when we're asking other nations to abide by a rules-based international framework, it is important that we ourselves show that we value and support those rules-based international frameworks. A multilateral rules-based system in which all countries observe international law gives us the best hope of reducing conflict. But countries have to feel they have buy-in to those systems. They have to feel that they've had a say in how those rules have been developed and how they're applied. And existing powers need to reach an accommodation with rising powers about those rules-based frameworks. Professor Hugh White, who is here today, has argued that the US and China need to rethink their relationship. He says that the US needs to share power with China to avoid conflict between them. Now, I'm not sure whether there needs to be an explicit agreement, but I do agree that both countries need to be very clear about their own interests and they have to be very clear in looking for ways of accommodating each other's interests. The best outcome, of course, is for them to work together over time to find common ground on how to meet each other's interests in the region. Former American diplomat Nicholas Burns suggested to this forum 2 years ago that political and military leaders from both countries spend too little time with each other. He argued that they need to keep making efforts at achieving greater contact, which will lead to better understanding. He said that America and China need to work harder to find ways to cooperate in regional initiatives. He suggested that dialogue be expanded to other countries in the region, including Australia. The US, Australia and others should identify concrete projects that would build cooperation and trust, and they should create pan-Asian institutions and make better use of existing ones to bind governments together in common purpose. And I think you can see from those comments 2 years ago a number of positive steps that follow in the direction that was identified by Nicholas Burns at that time. Conflict, of course, is not inevitable. The action of key players will determine the outcomes, especially leaders in China and the United States, but also the peoples of China and the United States. Will they act and behave in ways that contribute to win-win solutions to the challenges or to a zero-sum approach? That is, will they take a view that a gain for one country must be at the cost of the other country, or will they see that the strength of each can be to the benefit of both? There are voices in the US and China that focus on state power, especially its military dimension, and that consider that one nation's gain must be another nation's loss. But there are also many more optimistic voices who argue that states can make choices for a better world, and that through cooperation we can overcome the constraints of the zero-sum approach and achieve better outcomes all round. That's always been the guiding principle of Labor's foreign policy, and it should be the guiding principle in our relations with China. There are encouraging signs, as I said, that China is beginning to see merit in cooperation and engagement. There's been progress. As I said, I'm just back from a trip to China, and it was terrific to see in our meetings in Beijing last week that the issue of climate change was raised by our Chinese counterparts, including by Chinese climate change negotiator Xie Junhua of the National Development and Reform Commission. Our Chinese interlocutors told us that the trial emissions trading schemes running in several large cities will be extended in coming years to a national emissions trading scheme. They talked about reducing the carbon intensity of their economy, about reaching peak carbon soon, and about increasing the share of renewable energy that makes up the energy mix in China. They acknowledge their responsibilities as a global citizen, responsible for almost a third of the world's carbon emissions. And one reason that China is taking air pollution so seriously is the effect it's having on the quality of life of ordinary Chinese people. The air in their cities is unbreathable on some days. And there you see an example of where the domestic demands of a population with growing expectations is affecting the course of the leadership of the country. It was very interesting to speak to Xie Junhua because he's been the climate change negotiator for 9 years, and this is a very, very different position to the Chinese position at the Copenhagen the time of the Copenhagen Agreement. And in fact, I think there'd be people who would say that if this was the position at that time, there would have been a very different outcome from that conference. But of course, it's not just in this area where we're seeing increasing cooperation. China's cooperation on disaster relief training, another opportunity to improve communication and understanding, particularly between our armed forces. China's participation in the search for Malaysian Airlines MH370, again impressive and welcome. And of course, the noteworthy participation of China in this year's RIMPAC, a large naval exercise. It's quite a step forward to see our navies cooperating in this way. Although Australia is not one of the principal actors in this struggle between a great power and an emerging power, our close relationships with both the United States and China mean that we can and should contribute, and we should help shape a positive outcome for North Asia. We have a unique relationship with China. We're a Western country, a democracy, an ally of the United States, but we don't have colonial baggage and we have independent interests. China takes Australia seriously in part because of our importance as a supplier of vital resources like coal and iron ore, also for our potential as a supplier of agricultural products and services. And we're also well regarded, I believe, by other nations in North Asia and Southeast Asia. From opposition, the Australian Labor Party controversially adopted the policy of recognising the PRC in 1955, and Gough Whitlam moved to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC within 3 weeks of a Labor government being elected in December 1972. And believe it or not, the Chinese counterparts I was meeting with raised that in many of the meetings I was in, remembered it with great affection. Australian Prime Ministers have worked hard since then to continue to build on that good relationship. Prime Minister Bob Hawke presided over the start of the resource export boom to China, established the mechanisms to facilitate trade, and his government drove the creation of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Paul Keating expanded APEC to a leaders' forum. Prime Minister John Howard hosted the first official visit to Australia by a Chinese head of state, President Hu Jintao. Close engagement continued under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who made 3 visits to China and hosted 2 senior visits to Australia, including one from the current President Xi Jinping. And Prime Minister Julia Gillard struck a strategic partnership with China that established annual talks between the 2 countries' Prime Ministers, Treasurers and Foreign Ministers and Trade Ministers that are virtually unprecedented. So we have worked hard over both Labor and Liberal governments to build a close relationship with China to complement our historic and continuing closeness with our closest ally, the United States. Although the US and China don't need Australia as an intermediary, I think perhaps we might be of assistance in filling the awkward silences sometimes. Last week, Chinese officials urged us to promote people-to-people exchanges at senior levels, to increase exchanges by young political leaders, and to make more use of multilateral fora for dialogue on side issues, on the side when we're meeting in international meetings. We need to find ways of using our creative middle power diplomacy. We've always excelled at that. We've got Gareth Evans, of course, in the audience today, and his role in negotiating a resolution of the Cambodian conflict in the 1980s is a marvellous example of that. But I'd take you back to Doc Evatt and the establishment of the United Nations, where Doc Evatt argued for small and middle-sized countries to be given one vote for a democratic approach to the United Nations that would see small and middle-sized powers represented fairly. John Howard's role in leading international peacekeepers in East Timor in 1999, or Kevin Rudd's role in making the G20 the preeminent body for facing together the global financial crisis. All of these are examples of where a small country, relatively small population size, has actually had a big impact in our world. And as we have in the past, I think we can continue to play a role that is larger than our population size would suggest. In different ways, we have close relationships with the greatest existing and emerging powers of the 21st century, and we should use our closeness with each of them to encourage better understanding between them. Whatever we do, we need to apply maximum effort to thinking about and finding ways of achieving win-win solutions to the opportunities and the challenges that are posed by the rise of China. It's unlikely that there'll be a point for many decades at least where we can say for sure that we asked the right questions and we made the right answers. But the future's not predetermined. We help create the future through our actions and decisions, and yes, even through our assumptions. To have people behave as friends, it is important that we treat them as friends. If we keep working to find constructive win-win answers, we maximise the prospects for Australia's and for the region's prosperity and security. China can, of course, grow peacefully, and Australia and our region will benefit if it does. I'd like to end with the obligatory quote from Confucius, who was asked by one of his disciples, Zhejiang, for advice about proper conduct. Confucius replied, "Speak with loyalty and good faith, act with dedication and deference, and even among the barbarians, your conduct will be irreproachable." I think he means us. If you speak without loyalty and good faith, if you act without dedication or deference, your conduct will always be unacceptable, even in your own village. Wherever you stand, you should have this precept always in front of your eyes. Have it carved upon the yoke of your chariot, and only then will you be able to move ahead. The disciple Zhejiang did write down the precept, although not on the yoke of his chariot, but on a sash. And I'd like to think that each of us can consider and remember that precept as well, to speak with loyalty and good faith, and that our leaders in Asia, in Australia, in the United States will bear this advice in mind and will act as Prime Minister Lee suggested, with restraint and wisdom, to build a workable and peaceful accommodation. Thank you.
Turn to my timepiece.
Just one.
Yeah, okay. We've gone past 4:15, but Tanya's quite happy to take a question, so I will...
Make it a good one.
I will.
My favourite colour's blue, so don't waste it on that, all right?
Is up the back. Is that Tom, is it? Yeah.
Ms Plibersek, thank you very much. Great talk. Last week, the Defence Minister, David Johnston, told the ABC's Late Line program that in the event of a Sino-American stoush, the US alliance would not apply to Australia. In response, Michael Danby, Labor's Parliamentary Secretary, your colleague, said, basically lambasted the Defence Minister for not cleaving faithfully to all ANZUS. Question, what is the Labor opposition's position when it comes to any Sino-American stoush and what Australia should do under its obligations under ANZUS?
Well, I've just spent 35 minutes telling you that our position is that we're going to avoid a stoush, and I think that it is irresponsible for people like me to be going out and speculating about what happens if war breaks out. On the position of the disputed territory between China and Japan, we have been very clear that we don't take a position on the disputed territory. We've urged calm, we've urged no sudden moves, and that'll continue to be our position. I'm not going to go down a path of speculating about conflict, what form it would take, and what Australia's involvement would be.
Well said for our first diplomat in training. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great delight to have Tanya with us this morning, this afternoon. The most stimulating speech, very interesting. We're very grateful to you for giving up the time, for coming along. We're delightful. We're most happy that you are continuing to support the Alliance 21 project, and we're very grateful for the funding you put into it originally. Okay, thanks very much.